You ever move somewhere thinking you've finally made it, only to realize you accidentally signed up for the Hunger Games, Suburban Edition? That's exactly what happened to us. Red Maple Grove looked perfect on paper. Tree-lined streets, kids riding bikes, the smell of fresh-cut grass in the evenings, the kind of place where people still wave when they pass by. It was supposed to be peace, after decades of grinding it out. A calm retirement, a place to watch the birds, sip coffee on the porch, maybe grow old quietly without bothering anyone or being bothered. But what we didn't realize was that Red Maple Grove had a ruler, and she didn't wear a crown. She carried a clipboard. Karen was her name. A woman who somehow managed to combine the charm of a DMV worker with the power complex of a small-town dictator. And right behind her was Randy, her boyfriend, a part-time sheriff's deputy, with a chip on his shoulder the size of a small SUV. Together, they weren't just neighbors. They were a two-person regime. At first, we didn't see it. Like all traps, it was hidden under a welcome mat. The HOA seemed like just another part of suburban life, like mowing the lawn or putting up Christmas lights the day after Thanksgiving. We got the newsletters, all beige paper and polite fonts, with little notes about community standards and garbage can placement. The first real sign that something was off came the day Karen left a note on our door about our mailbox being half an inch too high, not a whole foot. Not leaning sideways like some sort of suburban Tower of Pisa, half an inch. I laughed when I read it, thought maybe she was just bored, needed a hobby, maybe too much time on her hands now that her kids were grown, or her last book club fell apart. But boredom doesn't explain what came next. Fines. Small at first, almost ridiculous. $50 for a garden gnome Jason had given me as a retirement gift. Apparently, it was non-compliant ornamentation. $100 because our American flag was too large for the visual harmony of the cul-de-sac. We shrugged, paid a few, argued a few, but you can't argue with someone who thinks HOA rules are divine commandments. Karen wasn't running a neighborhood, she was running a kingdom. And Randy, he was the muscle. Always lurking, sunglasses on, badge clipped to his belt like a silent warning. It stopped feeling like a neighborhood and started feeling like we were living in some HOA police state, where one misplaced flower pot might trigger a neighborhood inquisition. But the worst part was how easily it happened. One by one, people started falling in line. They trimmed their bushes an extra inch, painted their mailboxes the approved shade of agreeable beige, swapped out their welcome mats for HOA-sanctioned alternatives. Some of them didn't even seem to notice. Others noticed and just gave up. It's easier, right? Smile, nod, pay the fine, move along. That's how it spreads. That's how people like Karen win. But they made one fatal mistake. They pushed the wrong family too far. Because while I might sip my coffee quietly on the porch, my son Jason, he doesn't back down from a fight. Not the quiet ones. Not the ones wrapped in paperwork and passive-aggressive letters. Not even the ones hidden behind mirrored sunglasses and clipboards. And the moment Jason came home, the game changed. They just didn't know it yet. Jason wasn't the type to make a big entrance. No fireworks, no announcements. One day the driveway was empty. The next day there was a big Ford F-250 parked there. American flag sticker on the bumper, toolbox rattling when he closed the door. He kept to himself, helped out around the house, mowed the lawn like clockwork every Sunday morning, called every neighbor sir or ma'am, like he was raised to respect people, even if they didn't deserve it. Karen hated him immediately. I saw it in her eyes the first time she saw him standing in the driveway, wiping the dust off his truck after a long drive home. To her, he wasn't a neighbor. He was a threat. Too big. Too quiet. Too unpredictable. She said his truck was oversized according to community specs, whatever that meant. She claimed it disrupted the visual symmetry of the block. She even called our American flag hostile imagery in one of her little newsletters, carefully worded to sound official but dripping with judgment. At first, Jason laughed it off. He'd seen worse. A woman with a clipboard wasn't exactly top of his list of threats. But Karen didn't stop. She fined us for the truck, said it was 2 inches too wide for our driveway, that the front tires crossed the curb onto community common property. 2 inches. Jason just nodded when she said it. Polite, respectful, too respectful. I recognized that look, not the look of defeat, but calculation. He wasn't going to argue on her front lawn. He wasn't going to yell or threaten. That's not how Jason operates. Instead, he went quiet, went inside, and started working. Meanwhile, Randy ramped things up, started circling the block in his cruiser more often, parked at the corner with his windows down, sunglasses glinting in the sun, hands resting just a little too close to his holster. Karen, clipboard in hand, started citing people left and right, for garden hoses left visible, bird baths placed too close to the sidewalk, Halloween decorations left out past November 2nd. It was a full-on suburban witch hunt, and Randy played enforcer while Karen played judge, jury, and executioner. Neighbors stopped making eye contact. Birthday parties got smaller. Front porch conversations died out completely. You could feel it, this tightening, this fear. People started whispering behind closed doors about Karen, but nobody wanted to be the first to stand up. And then came the day Jason hung the bird feeder. It was so small, such a simple act, a way to bring a little beauty back to the front yard, a little life to the old oak tree that had been there long before Karen ever moved in. I was sitting on the porch, coffee in hand, watching him hook it gently to the lowest branch when I saw her. Karen. Marching down the sidewalk like she was General Patton leading a parade. And there, 2 steps behind her, Randy, mirrored sunglasses flashing, badge gleaming. I knew, the way you know a storm's about to break, that something was about to happen. Something we couldn't laugh off anymore. Karen didn't walk, she stormed. Clipboard tucked tight under her arm, lips pursed into that sour, lemon-sucking grimace she wore like perfume. Randy lumbered behind her like a bulldog that smelled blood. I stayed on the porch, heart pounding a little harder than I'd like to admit. But Jason, he didn't even glance their way. He calmly scooped a handful of birdseed from the bag and poured it into the feeder, like the 2 people stomping across our lawn didn't even exist. Karen didn't like being ignored. She cleared her throat, loud, sharp, and barked out that we were in violation of HOA Code 6.8b, unauthorized wildlife attraction devices. I almost laughed. Attraction devices. It was a $15 wooden bird feeder from the hardware store, not a missile silo. Jason finally turned, slow and easy, bird seed still dripping from his hand, and gave her the kind of look you reserve for children throwing tantrums over broken crayons. "You serious?" he asked, voice low, calm, almost amused. That's when Randy did the stupidest thing he's probably ever done in his life. Without a word, without a warning, Randy went for his holster and pulled his gun, a loaded service weapon, and aimed it right at my son's chest. Right there, in broad daylight, in front of neighbors peeking through curtains and porch screens. I froze. Every instinct in me screamed to move, to yell, to do something. But Jason didn't flinch. Not even a muscle twitched. He didn't lift his hands, didn't back up, didn't plead. He just stood there, still holding a scoop of birdseed, and stared down the barrel of that gun with a look so calm it sent a chill through my bones. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't defiance. It was something deeper. A cold, terrifying patience, like a predator who knows exactly how much danger the fool pointing that weapon is really in. Jason smiled then. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile that says, "I've been to hell and back, and you're about to learn you picked the wrong man on the wrong day. In that instant, it didn't matter that Randy had a badge. It didn't matter that Karen was standing there, arms folded, sneering like she had already won. Jason had them beat, and they didn't even know it yet. Because what neither of them realized was that Jason had been preparing for this moment for months. Quietly, carefully, like a soldier setting up camp behind enemy lines, he'd gathered evidence, read every line of the HOA bylaws, recorded every fine and citation, every harassment, every illegal move. They thought they were waging a war of notes and fines. Jason knew they were committing violations serious enough to make even a sleepy county courthouse sit up and take notice. And that bird feeder. That was never about the birds. That was Jason's line in the sand. They thought they were intimidating him. What they didn't see was the trap snapping shut around their ankles. The thing about Jason is, he doesn't lose his temper. He doesn't lash out. When he's pushed too far, he doesn't explode. He sharpens. That calmness he showed when Randy pointed that gun. That wasn't fear. That was the slow, deliberate stillness of a man who already knew the law, knew the evidence, and knew exactly how to end this. Not with fists, not with shouting, but with the kind of justice you can't squirm out of. What Karen and Randy didn't realize was, they weren't just fighting a grumpy homeowner. They were going up against a man who'd spent his life navigating minefields, both literal and political. They thought they were the ones holding power, because they had fines and threats and clipboards and badges. Jason was holding something stronger. Patience, discipline, and a folder thick enough to bury them both. And it wasn't just paper either. Jason knew how they operated. He knew Karen's little reign of terror didn't start with bird feeders. It started months before, with the harmless fines, the small abuses, the slow, creeping fear that kept everyone's heads down and voices silent. He saw how Randy abused his authority, how he used his badge not to serve and protect, but to intimidate and dominate. And Jason knew something even more important. Bullies don't expect resistance. They expect silence, compliance, fear. They don't prepare for someone who fights back the right way. Slow, steady, legal, ironclad. So Jason did what he does best. He prepared. Every conversation he had with Karen, every incident with Randy, he documented. He pulled public records. He took photos. He time-stamped violations. He cross-referenced HOA bylaws against what they were actually doing and found a mountain of discrepancies. He gathered complaints from neighbors who were too scared to speak alone, but willing to stand together if someone led the charge. He found the loopholes Karen had exploited, the fake proxy votes she had orchestrated to keep herself in power, the budget discrepancies that pointed to financial misconduct. He didn't just build a case. He built a wall so high and so solid that when it came down on Karen and Randy, there'd be no crawling out from underneath it. Karen and Randy thought they had already won when Randy drew that gun. They thought fear would end the fight before it started. But Jason didn't see a threat. He saw an opportunity. He saw a complete, airtight case fall right into his lap. Because when Randy pulled that weapon, he didn't just threaten my son. He committed a felony on private property in violation of a court-issued temporary protective order Jason had been granted just that morning. That violation alone was enough to destroy whatever shred of authority Randy thought he had left. Add in the illegal fines, the surveillance cameras pointed at private residences without consent, the misuse of HOA funds. And suddenly it wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. It was civil rights violations, abuse of authority, criminal misconduct. They thought they were untouchable. They thought the badge and the clipboard made them invincible. What they didn't realize was that the quiet guy watering the lawn, hanging bird feeders, calling people ma'am and sir, was actually building their reckoning, one piece of paper at a time. And by the time they figured that out, It was far, far too late. The minute Randy's finger touched that trigger, the minute he stepped across that invisible line between posturing and actual threat, everything Jason had been building clicked into place, and it didn't take long for the dominoes to start falling. Less than an hour later, real deputies, ones who didn't play neighborhood cop cosplay, pulled up at our curb. They weren't there for us. They weren't there to shake hands or hand out warnings. They came for Randy. Full cuffs, full reading of rights. Right there on our lawn while Karen stood frozen on the sidewalk, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. I watched neighbors peeking through blinds, standing behind screen doors, phones held discreetly at their sides recording everything. Some folks even stepped outside onto their porches, arms crossed, faces hard, no longer willing to pretend they didn't see what was happening. And Randy, he didn't say a word. Didn't resist. He just stared straight ahead as they led him away, his sunglasses slipping slightly down his nose, exposing the panic in his eyes. Karen tried to step forward, tried to argue, but one of the deputies held up a hand and told her to stay put. For once, she obeyed. Maybe she knew it was over. Maybe she still thought she could spin it somehow, fix it with enough lies and forms and frantic damage control. But there was no fixing this. Randy wasn't just facing internal review anymore. He was looking at assault charges, a restraining order violation, unlawful use of a firearm on private property, crimes that didn't just go away with a handshake and a shrug. Jason didn't celebrate. He didn't smile or pump his fist. He stood there, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with the same quiet patience he'd shown the day Randy pointed a gun at him. Calm, controlled, certain. Because Jason knew this wasn't the finish line. This was just the beginning. Karen still had her clipboard. She still had her newsletter. She still had the HOA board she had stacked with proxies and fake elections. And Jason wasn't about to let her wiggle out of this. Not after everything she'd put the neighborhood through. Not after she let Randy weaponize his badge to intimidate the very people he was supposed to protect. While Randy sat in the back of the patrol car, Karen retreated, storming back to her house like a general retreating after a lost battle. Her visor tilted sideways, her flip-flops slapping the pavement, still clutching that cursed clipboard to her chest like it was a shield. But the problem with people like Karen is they never see their own fall coming. They think if they just talk loud enough, spin enough stories, they can survive anything. They don't understand that sometimes the quiet people they bully the most are the ones quietly building the rope for their own noose. And Jason, he had that rope braided tighter than steel. He didn't waste time. The next morning, Jason marched into the county regulatory office with a file so thick it looked like it belonged in the archives, not in a suburban HOA dispute. Every violation Karen had ever committed, every misuse of funds, every illegal citation she had ever signed her smug little name to. It was all there, cross-referenced, time-stamped, organized into a neat, devastating chronology of abuse. Not just our story either. He had gathered sworn statements from half a dozen neighbors, each one backing up the timeline, each one adding another nail to the coffin Karen had spent 2 years building for herself. It wasn't just about us anymore. It was about the whole neighborhood. And the county. They took one look at that file and called an emergency review board hearing. Turns out, when you show up not just with accusations, but with rock-solid, undeniable proof, people stop brushing you off. They start paying real close attention. Karen didn't know any of that yet. She still thought she could spin it. Thought maybe she could send out a few newsletters, host a last-minute community unity potluck, rally whatever blind loyalty she had left. She was wrong. Word had already spread faster than gossip at a high school reunion. That evening, you could feel it in the air. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to each other in months were suddenly talking again. Little knots of people gathering on sidewalks, sharing stories, comparing finds, digging old citations out of kitchen drawers and junk piles. Karen had ruled through isolation, through making people feel small and alone and afraid. Jason shattered that silence with one move, and once neighbors realized they weren't alone, Karen's power evaporated like mist under the morning sun. It wasn't just the court and the county that had turned against her. It was her own kingdom. The night before the hearing, Jason sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open, highlighting last-minute notes, sipping coffee like he had all the time in the world. I watched him, remembering the young man who left for his first deployment, wondering how he'd ever learn to handle the unknown. Now I saw a man who didn't just survive chaos. He mastered it. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't angry. He was ready. Because Jason didn't believe in half measures. Not when it mattered. Not when people's homes, livelihoods, and peace of mind were at stake. Meanwhile, Karen was busy drafting the world's saddest email blast, trying to rally support, painting herself as the victim of a coordinated smear campaign, orchestrated by a few disgruntled residents. She accused Jason of militarizing the neighborhood. She blamed the online mob mentality. She whined about false narratives. She never once mentioned Randy, never once admitted any wrongdoing, because people like Karen never see themselves as wrong. They're always the hero of their own miserable little story. But this time, the neighborhood wasn't buying it. By morning, the hearing room at the county office was packed, not just with Jason and a few witnesses. Half of Red Maple Grove showed up. Even people I hadn't seen in months were there, holding folders, photos, old citations. The energy in the room was electric, not angry, not chaotic, just sharp and heavy, like everyone was done pretending. Karen walked in late, wearing a stiff, uncomfortable-looking pantsuit, clutching a couple of manila folders to her chest, like life preservers. She didn't smile, didn't greet anyone. She saw the crowd and knew immediately. This was no longer her show. Jason didn't grandstand. He didn't yell or call names. When it was his turn, he stood up, laid out the facts clearly, calmly, methodically. Date by date, violation by violation, illegal cameras, fines issued without due process, HOA funds diverted for personal expenses, abuse of authority, collusion with her boyfriend Randy to enforce illegal citations through intimidation. Every claim backed up with documents, photos, videos, statements. Every lie Karen ever told laid bare for the entire community to see. There was no bluster, no drama, just the weight of truth, crashing down one page at a time. By the time Jason finished speaking, you could have heard a pin drop in that room. And Karen, she didn't say a word, because what could she say? The walls she built so carefully, one false fine and one forged proxy vote at a time, had finally collapsed, and the rubble was all around her. By the time the board members recessed to deliberate, Karen sat stiffly in her chair, clutching that clipboard like it might shield her from what was coming. She didn't make eye contact with anyone. Not the neighbors she used to command like a queen barking orders. Not the board members she once bullied into submission. She just stared straight ahead, jaw tight, eyes glassy, as if sheer willpower alone could change the outcome. But even Karen must have felt it, the ground slipping out from under her high horse. And when the board returned, they didn't even pretend to sugarcoat it. The lead investigator stood, and in a voice that brooked no argument, announced that Karen was being immediately and permanently removed from her position on the Red Maple Grove HOA board. Effective now. No appeals, no tricks, no last-minute loopholes. They weren't just removing her. They were recommending criminal charges. Fraud, embezzlement, abuse of authority, unlawful surveillance. The list sounded endless, and with every word, Karen seemed to shrink smaller and smaller into that chair she used to look down from like a throne. But what really finished it wasn't the official verdict. It was the reaction of the room. The second the words were out of the investigator's mouth, the neighbors she had lorded over for years erupted. Applause, cheers, even a few whoops from the back rows. Someone yelled, "About time!" And someone else held up a sign that just said, "Free the bird feeders." I swear I even saw Mrs. Lennox, the sweet 84-year-old woman Karen once fined for algae in her bird bath, pump her fist in the air. Karen tried to save face. She stood up fast, tried to storm out like she was too good for all of us. But as she turned, her precious clipboard slipped from her grasp and landed face down on the dirty tiled floor. Papers scattered everywhere. Fines, notices, warnings, like the final exhale of her crumbling empire. She looked down at them for a moment, then at all of us, like maybe she thought someone would help her, pick it up for her, pretend for just a second longer that she was still important. Nobody moved. Jason didn't even blink. Karen left the room without her clipboard, without her power, without her reputation. And in the days that followed, Red Maple Grove felt like a different place. You could almost feel the whole neighborhood take a breath it hadn't dared take in years. There were meetings now, real ones where everyone got a vote. The ornamental garden gnome ban, gone. The flag size restrictions, gone. Bird feeders, legalized, celebrated even. Jason, of course, was offered a seat on the temporary board almost immediately. Everyone wanted him to lead, to keep things honest, to make sure no one ever pulled another Karen on us again. But Jason just smiled politely and declined, said he'd had enough of fights for a lifetime, said all he wanted was to live quietly, to plant some tomatoes, maybe put up a second bird feeder for good measure. And true to his word, Jason melted right back into the fabric of the neighborhood, like he had never caused a ripple. But everyone knew what he had done. Not just me, not just the neighbors who cheered that day, but even the ones who had once feared speaking up. Jason hadn't just stood up to Karen. He'd taught the entire neighborhood that silence doesn't protect you. It just prolongs the pain. And because of him, people started living freely again. Within weeks, front yards started to bloom with a new kind of pride. Flags flew higher, brighter. Gnomes appeared in gardens, some with little signs that read, "Still standing." Kids who used to be told to play in the backyards came racing through the cul-de-sacs again. Bikes squeaking, laughter echoing like it hadn't in years. Even old Max, our golden retriever, seemed to move with a little more bounce in his arthritic steps, greeting every neighbor like he was the unofficial mayor of Red Maple Grove. And our bird feeder, the one Jason had hung on that old oak tree, swayed proudly in the breeze. Cardinals, blue jays, even the occasional cheeky squirrel, all of them reminders that no one could tell us we didn't belong here anymore. Jason added another pole too, one just beside it, flying the POWMIA flag right next to the stars and stripes. A small, silent monument to the fights you can't always see, the ones that happen on front lawns instead of battlefields, but matter just as much. Karen, meanwhile, tried to move to another neighborhood. Word is, she found a gated community a few towns over that didn't have an HOA. But gossip travels faster than moving trucks, and it didn't take long before people figured out who she was, what she had done, and why Red Maple Grove was finally free. Last I heard, she's renting a one-bedroom condo, no clipboard, no kingdom, no neighbors bowing their heads when she walks by. I almost feel sorry for her. Almost. The funny thing is, you'd think the story ended there. Happy neighborhood, evil overthrown, peace restored. But peace isn't just something you get. It's something you fight for, and something you defend, even when it feels like you're fighting over the smallest, most ridiculous things. Bird feeders, lawn heights, garden gnomes. Because if you give up those little freedoms, if you let a Karen slip into power without a challenge, before you know it, you wake up one morning and realize you're living in a place where no one even dares put out a flag without permission. Now, every evening, Jason and I sit out on the porch, sipping coffee, watching the sunset dip behind the rooftops, listening to the cicadas buzz and the birds chatter at the feeder he fought for. Sometimes neighbors walk by and wave. Sometimes they stop and chat. No one talks about fines or warnings anymore. No one fears getting a letter about the wrong shade of mulch. We don't take those moments for granted. We know exactly what they cost. And every now and then, Jason will glance at that bird feeder, then at me and say, "Funny, isn't it? How something so small can mean so much." And I'll smile back, because I know he's not just talking about the feeder. He's talking about freedom, about standing up when no one else will, about fighting the battles no one sees until they're already lost. It turns out some wars aren't fought overseas. Some wars happen right in your front yard, on a hot afternoon under an old oak tree, with nothing but birdseed in one hand and truth in the other. And sometimes the people who win those wars don't even have to raise their voices. They just have to refuse to back down.